Christmas used to smell like my mother's cinnamon rolls. Like pine needles and wood smoke from the fireplace my father insisted on lighting, even though it hadn't worked properly since I was 12. Every December 25th, our house in rural Pennsylvania transformed into something from a Hallmark movie, minus the meet-cute and guaranteed happy ending. My name is Charlotte Reed, and growing up, Christmas was the one day a year when my family pretended we weren't slowly falling apart. When my father's drinking was festive instead of concerning. When my mother's critical comments were disguised as love. When my younger brother Tony could do no wrong, while I could do nothing right. I joined the Army at 18, partly out of duty, partly to escape. The military gave me structure, purpose, and distance, 3 things I desperately needed. My parents called it running away. I called it survival. 9 years, 2 deployments, and 1 combat injury later. I left the service with a medical discharge, a modest pension, and skills that didn't translate neatly onto civilian resumes. I was 30 years old with a limp that ached when it rained and nightmares that came whether I wanted them or not. "You should have gone to college," my mother had said when I called to tell her I was out. "Now you've wasted your prime years. And for what? A bad knee and no career?" I stopped calling after that. For 3 years, I kept my distance. Christmas cards instead of visits. Brief texts on birthdays. It wasn't healing exactly, but it was peaceful. I moved to Seattle, far from Pennsylvania's snow and suffocating memories. I found work as a security consultant for a tech startup, leveraging my military experience in ways my parents would never understand. The job paid well, but the real money came later, after I noticed vulnerabilities in their system that no one else saw. I developed a patch, which led to a specialized software product, which led to my own company. CyberShield Security Solutions launched with 3 employees in a cramped office with secondhand furniture. 2 years later, we had 42 employees. Contracts with government agencies and acquisitions offers I wasn't ready to consider. My 1-bedroom apartment became a lakeside condo. My military pension gathered dust in an account I never touched. I didn't tell my family about any of it. Then my grandmother died 2 weeks before Christmas, and suddenly the distance I'd cultivated collapsed. She was my mother's mother, a tough, practical woman who had slipped me $20 bills throughout my childhood, whispering, "Keep this for yourself, Charlotte. A woman always needs her own money." She was the only one who had supported my enlistment, who had written me letters while I was deployed, who had never once called my choices into question. I flew back for the funeral despite the panic that rose in my chest as the plane touched down in Pittsburgh. My parents picked me up at the airport, my mother's eyes red-rimmed but dry, my father's handshake stiff and formal, like I was a business associate instead of his daughter. "You look different," my mother said, giving me a once-over that lingered, on my tailored pantsuit and the watch I'd bought myself after signing our biggest contract. "It's been 3 years, Mom." "You've put on weight," she added, sliding into the passenger seat of my father's decade-old Buick. I bit my tongue. At 33, I was finally comfortable in my body, stronger than I'd ever been thanks to the physical therapy I'd committed to after my discharge. The weight was muscle, confidence, and the meals I no longer skipped when anxiety tightened my throat. The drive to their house was filled with updates I hadn't asked for. Tony had been promoted at the local bank. My cousin Jessica was expecting her 3rd child. The Millers down the street had finally renovated their hideous porch. Nothing about their lives, nothing about mine. The unspoken agreement: we would coexist without connecting. Grandmother's funeral was on December 23rd. A brief service, a cold cemetery, relatives I barely recognized offering condolences with curious eyes that kept returning to my exotic West Coast presence. I wore black, spoke little, and counted the hours until I could return to my hotel room. Then my mother announced at the post-funeral gathering, "You'll stay with us for Christmas, of course." It wasn't a question. In the calcified hierarchy of Our family, my preferences had never registered. I have a flight on the 26th, I said, which was true, though I'd specifically booked it to avoid Christmas Day at their house. I should probably stay at the hotel. I have some work to do and… Work? On Christmas? My father's voice carried across my aunt's living room. What kind of job makes you work on Christmas? My company, I said quietly, then immediately regretted it. Company? My mother's eyebrows arched. You mean that security thing? Charlotte, a real company has benefits and retirement plans. That sounds like freelancing. I didn't correct her. How could I explain that I had 23 people reporting to me directly? That I had health insurance better than anything they'd ever had? That I'd paid cash for my condo? Stay with us, my mother insisted again. It's what your grandmother would have wanted, and there it was. The perfect manipulation, the invocation of the dead to control the living. I looked at my mother's face, searching for genuine desire to reconnect, but found only the determination not to be seen as the woman whose daughter chose a hotel over family at Christmas. Fine, I said, just until the 26th. The next day, Christmas Eve. I moved my suitcase into my childhood bedroom, unchanged since high school with its faded soccer trophies and honor roll certificates. The twin bed groaned under my weight. The closet still held clothes I'd outgrown half a lifetime ago. I sat on the edge of the bed, thumbing through emails on my phone, approving year-end bonuses for my employees, confirming details for our January product launch, normal CEO things that would sound like fiction to the people downstairs. Charlotte, dinner! My mother's voice carried the same urgent summons of my childhood, as if being prompt to dinner was the measure of a person's character. I tucked my phone away and descended into the minefield of family dinner, where casual questions concealed, traps and reminiscences doubled as indictments. What I didn't know then was that Christmas Eve was just the rehearsal for Christmas Day, when the real performance would begin. I didn't know that within 24 hours, I would sit across from my parents at a table laden with turkey and resentment, that words would be spoken that couldn't be taken back, that the careful walls I'd built between my past and present would come crashing down. I didn't know I was walking into an ambush. Christmas Eve dinner was a preview of the tensions to come. My brother Tony arrived with his wife Melissa and their 2 children, Emma, 7, and Jacob, 4. The perfect nuclear family, complete with matching holiday sweaters and a tin of homemade cookies that my mother fawned over as if they contained the secret to eternal life. Aunt Charlotte, Emma had squealed, wrapping her arms around my waist. Mommy says you live where it rains all the time. I smiled, genuinely happy to see her. It does rain a lot in Seattle, but it's beautiful too. The mountains touch the water, and there are evergreen trees taller than this house. Mountains like in Frozen? Her eyes widened. Even bigger, I promised. Don't fill her head with nonsense, my mother interrupted, ushering Emma toward the dining room. Dinner's getting cold. The table had been set with the good china, the set that only appeared on holidays and when the pastor came for dinner. My father sat at the head, carving knife poised over a ham that must have cost a third of their monthly grocery budget. My mother bustled around with serving dishes, refusing help even as she complained about doing everything herself. Tony, predictably, was seated at my father's right hand, Melissa next to my mother. The children had special booster seats decorated with Santa Claus. I was placed at the far end, across from Jacob, who had a tendency to launch food projectiles when bored. So Charlotte, Tony began as we passed dishes around. Still doing that. Security guard thing? The dismissiveness in his tone wasn't subtle. Even after my explanation about cybersecurity consulting during my last visit years ago, they all insisted on reducing my career to security guard. Something like that, I replied, not wanting to start a fight on Christmas Eve with my grandmother, barely in the ground. Tony just got promoted to regional loan officer, my mother announced proudly. They're giving him a company car in January. That's great, I said, and meant it. Tony had always thrived in structured environments with clear paths to advancement. The local bank was perfect for him. Congratulations. It means a lot of responsibility, Tony puffed up slightly. But they recognize talent when they see it. Not everyone can handle financial matters at this level. I took a large bite of mashed potatoes to avoid responding. I'd reviewed our company's IPO paperwork just last week, a filing that would value CyberShield at just under 9 figures. But explaining that would sound like boasting, or worse, lying. Charlotte doesn't have a family to support, my mother added, as if this disqualified me from understanding responsibility. It's different when you have children depending on you. I felt the familiar sting, but let it pass. I'd chosen not to have children yet, though I'd frozen my eggs last year. A decision that would horrify my Catholic mother if she knew. My life was full in different ways. Mentoring programs for female veterans, the scholarship foundation I'd started anonymously, the team I'd built from nothing. How is your friend in Seattle? My mother continued, the hesitation making it clear she was fishing. Maya? She's good. Her architecture firm is thriving. My mother's lips tightened. I knew what she was asking, and I deliberately misunderstood. Maya was my best friend, not my partner, but my mother's perpetual concern about my relationship status never distinguished between the two. At 33, being unmarried was, in her worldview, a symptom of fundamental failure as a woman. No special man in your life yet? She pressed. Mom, I sighed. I'm focused on my career right now. Charlotte thinks she's too good for the men around here, my father interjected, gesturing with his knife. Always did. Too smart, too ambitious. That's not it at all, I started, but Tony interrupted. Remember Ryan Gilbert? He asked about you the other day. Divorced now, but he's doing really well with his father's construction business. Ryan Gilbert had tried to put his hand up my skirt at senior prom after spiking my drink. I'd broken his finger and walked 5 miles home in the rain rather than spend another minute with him. I'm not interested in Ryan Gilbert, I said firmly. You're getting older, Charlotte, my mother said in that gentle, devastating way she had perfected. You might need to adjust your expectations. Not everyone gets to have it all. I looked around the table, at my brother's smug satisfaction, my mother's disappointed concern, my father's dismissal. Only the children seemed neutral, more interested, in pushing peas around their plates than in my marital status. I'm very happy with my life, I said quietly. Really? No one believed me. In their narrative, a woman alone was a woman incomplete. Success without marriage was failure by another name. My father changed the subject to the church roof fundraiser, and I retreated into silence, counting the hours until my flight home. After dinner, I helped clear the table while Tony and Melissa took the children into the living room to place cookies for Santa. My mother washed dishes with aggressive efficiency while I dried. Your grandmother asked about you all the time, she said suddenly, handing me a dripping plate. Even when you couldn't be bothered to visit. The unfairness of this stung. I called her every Sunday, Mom. We had a standing phone date for years. It's not the same as being here. I sent her plane tickets twice. She chose not to use them. My mother scrubbed harder at an already clean casserole dish. She was old. She couldn't travel across the country by herself. I offered to fly back and accompany her. She said she didn't want to leave her garden. This was true. My grandmother had outlived 2 husbands and had finally, in her 80s, created a life that was entirely her own. She'd understood my need for the same independence in a way my mother never had. Well, my mother sniffed, she left you something in her will. The lawyer will read it after Christmas. I hadn't expected this. Mom, don't be so quick to refuse, she cut me off. You might need help someday. Security guard jobs don't come with pensions, you know. I bit back my correction. Let her believe what she wanted. Tomorrow was Christmas Day, and then I'd be gone, back to my real life, my chosen life. That night, Lying in my childhood bed, I checked my company email one last time. Our end-of-year numbers had come in even stronger than projected. The Veterans Coding Boot Camp we'd sponsored had graduated its first class with a 94% job placement rate. 3 major corporations had reached out about our new security protocol. I read an email from Maya. "How's the family visit from hell? Remember, you're not that scared little girl anymore. You're Commander Reed, badass CEO and my personal hero. Don't let them make you small." I smiled in the dark, tears pricking at my eyes. Maya was right. I wasn't that girl anymore. So why did 12 hours in this house make me feel like I'd never left, never grown, never succeeded? Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the familiar nightmare. Sand and blood and the sound of my team screaming as the IED exploded. I woke at dawn, sweating despite the cold Pennsylvania winter, and knew there would be no more rest. I showered, dressed in black jeans and a cashmere sweater, and went downstairs to make coffee. The house was still quiet. Through the kitchen window, I could see fresh snow falling, covering my grandmother's dormant garden in a pristine blanket of white. "You're up early," my father said, startling me as he entered the kitchen still in his robe. Always were a light sleeper. It wasn't a light sleep that woke me, but I nodded anyway. "Merry Christmas, Dad," he grunted, reaching past me for the coffee pot. In the gray morning light, he looked older than his 65 years. The shadows under his eyes deeper, his shoulders more stooped. For a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. Had his life turned out the way he expected? Had mine? "Big day," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Your mother's been planning this dinner for weeks, even before. Before Grandma died, he meant." I nodded again. "I'm looking forward to it." We both knew I was lying, but sometimes families run on lies. Little ones that lubricate the grinding gears of relationships that would otherwise seize up entirely. Little did I know that in less than 12 hours, those lies would no longer be enough. That the careful facade would shatter like the crystal goblet my mother only used on Christmas Day. Christmas morning in the Reed household had its own choreography, unchanged since my childhood. First came the cinnamon rolls, my mother's one culinary triumph, the scent filling the house and drawing everyone to the kitchen. Then presents under the tree, opened in order from youngest to oldest. Then church, where we'd squeeze into a pew and sing carols, while my father nodded off and my mother elbowed him awake. Finally, Christmas dinner at 3 o'clock sharp, the centerpiece of the day. I went through the motions mechanically. I exclaimed over Emma's delight at her new doll, complimented Jacob on his toy trucks, thanked my parents for the department, store sweater that was 2 sizes too large and nothing I would ever wear in Seattle. I gave Tony and Melissa the gift cards I'd hastily purchased at the airport, and presented my parents with an expensive bottle of scotch my father would appreciate but never acknowledge. The gifts I'd actually put thought into. The custom artwork. For Tony's family, based on their favorite vacation spot, the rare first edition cookbook for my mother, the handcrafted fishing lures for my father, remained wrapped in my suitcase. After the cold reception yesterday, I'd decided to save them for another time, or perhaps return them entirely. "We should leave for church in 20 minutes, my mother announced, already dressed in her Christmas best, a red wool dress with a brooch my father had given her on their 30th anniversary. "Charlotte, is that what you're wearing?" I looked down at my outfit. I'd chosen carefully. Designer jeans that looked like regular denim to the untrained eye, paired with a simple gray cashmere sweater that had cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage payment. My only visible luxury was the watch, a Cartier I'd bought after our first major contract. It was understated compared to the diamond-encrusted pieces favored by other women in my position, but still unmistakably expensive. "Yes," I said. "Is there a problem?" "It's Christmas," my mother replied, as if that explained everything. "Don't you have a dress?" I did, in fact, have several dresses in my suitcase, none of which would have met her approval. Too modern, too form-fitting, too expensive-looking, too much like the successful woman I'd become rather than the dutiful daughter she wanted me to be. "This is fine for church," I said. "I'm comfortable." She sighed, the sound eloquently communicating her disappointment. "Well, we can't be late. You know how Father Donnelly gets." The local Catholic church was exactly as I remembered. The same worn pews, the same stained glass windows depicting saints in various states of martyrdom, the same musty hymnal with dog-eared pages. We sat in what had always been our pew, 5 rows from the front on the right side, my father on the end for a quick escape, my mother beside him, then Tony and his perfect family, with me on the far edge, as if my unmarried state might be contagious. Father Donnelly had aged considerably since I'd last seen him. His homily centered on family, tradition, and the sacred bonds that, in his words, connect us to each other and to God's purpose. I let the familiar cadence of his voice wash over me, thinking instead about the quarterly report I needed to review before the new year, the meeting with potential investors scheduled for January 3rd, the calls I should make to check on my team members spending the holidays alone. After church came the interminable socializing in the vestibule. Old neighbors, my parents' friends, people who had known me since birth and now scrutinized me with barely concealed curiosity. "Charlotte, my goodness, how long has it been?" Mrs. Winters, my former Sunday school teacher, gripped my hands in her bony fingers. "Still out in... was it Oregon?" "Washington," I corrected. "Seattle? And no husband yet?" Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "A pretty girl like you? You're not getting any younger, you know." I'd heard some version of this at least, 15 times in the past 24 hours. "I'm focusing on my career right now," I repeated mechanically. "Well, there's more to life than work," she said with a knowing nod toward my brother's family. "Tony has it all figured out, doesn't he? Such beautiful children." I smiled tightly and excused myself, making my way through the crowd to where my parents were speaking with Father Donnelly. As I approached, I caught the end of their conversation. "Worried about her, Father," my mother was saying. "All alone in that city, no family, no church community." "Mom," I interrupted, feeling heat rise to my face. "I'm right here. You could ask me directly if you're concerned." My mother had the grace to look embarrassed, but Father Donnelly smiled benignly. "Charlotte, wonderful to see you. Your parents are just showing the natural concern any loving family would have for a child so far from home." Child. I was 33 years old, ran a multi-million-dollar company, had survived a war zone, and had created a life entirely on my terms. But here, in this church, in this town, I would always be a child. Specifically, a wayward one who had strayed from the prescribed path. "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I'm doing very well in Seattle." Of course," he patted my arm. "And we pray that the Lord guides you back to what truly matters in life." The implication was clear. What I valued, my independence, my career, my chosen family of friends, didn't truly matter. Only blood relations, marriage, and children counted in their ledger of success. By the time we arrived home, my jaw ached from forced smiling and my patience had worn to a dangerous thinness. I retreated to my room under the pretense of changing for dinner, though in reality, I needed 20 minutes away from the constant judgment, the subtle digs, the unasked questions that nonetheless received disappointing answers. I sat on my bed and opened my laptop, scanning emails, checking the company chat where my employees were sharing photos of their holiday celebrations. I'd given everyone substantial bonuses this year, in addition to the profit-sharing plan that had already made several early employees paper millionaires once we went public. My executive assistant, Diane, had sent a photo of her family opening the gifts I'd sent, including the down payment for a house, disguised as a performance bonus, after she'd confided that they'd been priced out of the Seattle housing market. These were the relationships that sustained me now. People who saw me clearly, who valued what I'd built, who understood the path I'd chosen. "Charlotte," my mother's voice carried up the stairs. "We're waiting on you for dinner." I closed my laptop with a sigh and prepared myself for the main event. As I descended the stairs, the smell of roast turkey and my grandmother's secret stuffing recipe filled the air. The dining room table had been extended to its full length and covered with the good linen tablecloth, yellowed slightly with age. The best china gleamed under the light of the chandelier. My mother was placing the final serving dish, green beans with almonds, a concession to modern tastes amid the traditional fare, when I entered. My father was already seated at the head of the table, an empty wine glass in front of him that would soon be filled and refilled throughout the meal. Tony and Melissa were settling the children with plastic cups and extra napkins. "Finally," my mother said with a pointed glance at the clock, though I was at most 2 minutes late. "Take your seat so your father can carve the turkey." I sat in my designated spot, directly across from Tony, and placed my napkin in my lap. My father stood, carving knife and fork in hand, and began the ritual slicing of the turkey, laying pieces on a serving platter with the precision of a surgeon. This was his moment, his annual demonstration of patriarchal provision, and we all watched in the expected reverent silence. "White or dark meat, Charlotte?" he asked when he reached my plate, the carving tools suspended over the platter. "Dark." "Please," I said, the same answer I'd given every Christmas for as long as I could remember. He nodded and served me 2 pieces, then continued around the table. Once everyone was served, my mother led a prayer, her voice carrying the familiar rhythm of gratitude for family, health, and blessings, though I noticed she didn't specifically mention my presence as she did Tony's. As we began to eat, the conversation stayed safely in neutral territory. Compliments on the food, commentary on the church service, gentle corrections of the children's table manners. I allowed myself to relax slightly, thinking perhaps we might make it through the meal without incident. Then my father cleared his throat, a sound I'd learned to dread from childhood. It signaled a pronouncement, an opinion that would brook no disagreement, a judgment about to be rendered. "So, Charlotte," he said, setting down his fork, "Tony tells me your security job might be in trouble with all these tech layoffs we keep hearing about." I felt a familiar tightness in my chest as all eyes turned toward me. Tony had a smug expression, the look he'd worn since childhood whenever he'd managed to focus my parents' disapproval in my direction. My mother paused, fork halfway to her mouth, waiting for my response. Even the children seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, suddenly interested in the adult conversation. "Tech layoffs?" I repeated, buying time while deciding how to respond. "I haven't had any issues with that." "It's all over the news," Tony pressed. "Silicon Valley, Seattle, massive cuts. They're saying it's worse than 2008 for the tech industry. Seems like an unstable career path to me." I took a sip of water, considering my options. I could correct him, explain that as the founder and CEO of my company, I wasn't at risk of being laid off. I could tell them about our growth trajectory, our upcoming IPO, the acquisition offers I'd turned down. But experience had taught me that any success I claimed would be met with skepticism at best, accusations of exaggeration at worst. "I'm fine, Tony," I said simply. "My position is secure." "For now," my father interjected. "But you've got no safety net out there, no family nearby if things go south." "I have friends," I countered. "Good ones." "Friends aren't family," my mother said, as if reciting a fundamental truth of the universe. "When real trouble comes, you need blood." I thought of Maya, who had sat with me through nightmare-plagued nights after my return from Afghanistan. Of Diane, who had driven me to physical therapy appointments when my knee was at its worst. Of James, my CTO, who had worked around the clock alongside me when we were scrambling to meet our first major deadline. "I disagree," I said quietly. "Family is about who shows up when you need them." My father's face darkened. What's that supposed to mean? We've always been here. Here. In this unchanging house, in this unchanging town. They'd been geographically constant, I'd give them that. But emotionally present? Supportive of my choices? Proud of my achievements? The evidence suggested otherwise. What Charlotte means, Tony said with a condescending smile, is that she's found her tribe of other career-obsessed women who've chosen work over family. I set my fork down carefully. That's not what I mean. And you know it. Girls, please, my mother interjected, as if we were still teenagers squabbling over the bathroom. It's Christmas. I'm just concerned, Tony continued, ignoring her. With the economy like it is and Charlotte's situation, she should think about moving back home, getting a stable job at the bank. We always need security personnel. The idea was so ludicrous that I nearly laughed. Leave my company, my creation, my legacy, to become a bank security guard in my hometown? It would be like asking Picasso to paint houses. I appreciate the concern, I said, forcing neutrality into my voice. But I'm doing fine in Seattle. Fine isn't secure, my father said. Fine isn't a future. Look at your brother. Management position, pension plan, house nearly paid off, 2 beautiful children. That's success. That's security. I looked at Tony's life, the local accomplishments, the predictable progression, the conventional choices. It was a good life, a respectable life. But it was never the one I wanted. Different people want different things, I said carefully. Tony's path works for him. Mine works for me. Does it? My mother's question hung in the air. Are you really happy, Charlotte? Alone in that apartment? Working all hours? No husband? No children? Before I could answer, Jacob knocked over his milk, creating a momentary distraction as Melissa jumped up to clean the spill. I used the moment to breathe deeply, to center myself. This was why I'd stayed away for 3 years. This constant evaluation, and finding me wanting. When order was restored, my father returned to his original point with the tenacity of someone who believes they're delivering hard truths for my own good. The tech bubble always bursts eventually, he said. And then what? You'll be middle-aged with no family, no roots, and a resume gap. At least Tony will always have his family to fall back on. Dad, I started, but he wasn't finished. I worry. About you, Charlotte. We all do. You left the military with a medical discharge, no college degree, and jumped into this security consultant thing. It's not stable. It's not a career with a future. 10 years I'd spent building my company. 10 years of 18-hour days, of risking everything, of proving myself in an industry dominated by men half my age with Stanford degrees. 10 years of growth, of learning, of creating something from nothing. And in his eyes, it was still just a stopgap, a placeholder until I found a real career. Maybe Charlotte likes living on the edge, Tony added with a smirk. Military, then startup, always running toward risk. Or away from responsibility, my father muttered. I felt heat rising in my face. That's not fair. What's not fair, my mother interjected, is how you cut us out of your life. 3 years, Charlotte. 3 Christmases missed. Birthdays, anniversaries. You didn't even come when your father had his heart scare. The heart scare had been indigestion after eating an entire pepperoni pizza, something I'd only discovered after flying into a panic when Tony called to tell me Dad was at the hospital with chest pains. By the time I'd arranged emergency leave and booked a last-minute flight, my father was home watching baseball and annoyed by the fuss. No one had bothered to update me. I tried to stay connected, I said. I called. I sent gifts. I invited you to visit. Seattle is so far, my mother complained, and flights are expensive. I had offered to pay for their tickets multiple times, but that fact conveniently disappeared from the family narrative. The point is, my father continued, you've chosen a risky path, And sooner or later, it's going to catch up with you. Tech companies fold overnight. Look at what happened to WeWork, to Theranos. The comparison of my legitimate cybersecurity firm to infamous corporate frauds was the last straw. My company is nothing like Theranos, I said, my voice sharper than intended. We have real products, real revenue, real clients, including several Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. I can't even name because of security clearances. Silence fell over the table. This was more detail than I'd ever shared about my work, and I could see skepticism bloom across my father's face. Government agencies, he repeated flatly. Right. It's true, I insisted, though I knew immediately I'd made a mistake. Never defend, never explain. The rule I'd learned after years of family dinners where my accomplishments were minimized and my setbacks magnified. I'm sure Charlotte thinks she's very important, Tony said to my father with a conspiratorial smile. All those Seattle tech types do. I don't just think it, I snapped. We have contracts worth millions. I employ 42 people. Millions. My father interrupted with a scoff. Come on, Charlotte. We're your family. You don't have to exaggerate. The dismissal was so automatic, so complete, that for a moment I couldn't speak. Not because I was hurt, though I was, but because I was suddenly incandescently angry. 3 days of subtle digs, of condescension, of having my life choices questioned had reached a critical mass. Do you think I'm lying? I asked quietly. I think you're embellishing, my mother supplied diplomatically. It's understandable. You want us to think you're doing well. I am doing well, I insisted. Better than well. Of course you are, Tony said in the patronizing tone he reserved for his children and apparently his delusional sister. But there's no shame in admitting you're struggling. We all hit rough patches. I looked around the table, at my brothers. Smug certainty, my father's dismissal, my mother's concern tinged with pity. Even Melissa was watching me with the uncomfortable expression of someone witnessing a public meltdown. Only the children seemed neutral, mercifully absorbed in their food. I'm not struggling, I said, my voice level despite the anger coursing through me. CyberShield Security Solutions, my company, is valued at $87 million. We're preparing for an IPO next quarter that will likely double that valuation. I own 62% of the company. The silence that followed was absolute. Not even the clink of silverware interrupted it. That's, my father started, then stopped. That can't be right. It is right, I replied, pulling out my phone. I can show you the latest valuation report if you'd like, or our client list, or the term sheet for our Series C funding round that closed last month. 87 million? Tony repeated, his voice higher than usual. That's not possible. Why not? I challenged, looking him directly in the eye. Because I'm just Charlotte? Because I'm just a security guard? Because I didn't follow the path you all laid out for me? Don't be dramatic, my mother interjected. No one said you couldn't be successful. We just worry about stability. My company has been profitable for 6 consecutive quarters, I continued, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. We have clients in 23 countries. The software I developed is being used by 3 different intelligence agencies. I have a team of engineers with PhDs from MIT and Stanford. Last year, I was named one of Forbes' 40 under 40 in tech. My father set down his wine glass with a thud. If all that's true, why have you never mentioned it before? The question caught me off guard. Why hadn't I told them? The answer came to me with sudden clarity, because on some level, I'd known they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, they would believe me but still find a way to diminish it. Would you have believed me? I asked. Of course, my mother said immediately, but her eyes slid away from mine, confirming my suspicion. We're your family, my father added. We want you to succeed. But his tone suggested an addendum. We want you to succeed on our terms. In ways, we understand and approve of. If you're so successful, Tony said, the edge in his voice betraying his discomfort. Why do you live in an apartment instead of a mansion? Where's your fancy car? Your designer clothes? I looked down at my cashmere sweater. Subtle, expensive, but not flashy. My watch, which cost more than Tony's car. The understated diamond studs in my ears that had been my gift to myself when we landed our first 7-figure contract. I don't need to flaunt my success, I replied. I invest most of what I make back into the company or into causes I care about. Like what? My mother asked, sounding genuinely curious for the first time. I hesitated, then decided there was no point in holding back now. I fund a coding boot camp for female veterans transitioning to civilian careers. I've established a scholarship for girls from rural communities who want to study computer science. I contribute to several organizations that support wounded warriors and their families. My father's expression had shifted from dismissal to confusion to something harder to read. Why didn't you tell us any of this? The question hung in the air between us. Why hadn't I shared my successes with my family? The people who should have been proudest of me, who should have celebrated my achievements? Because every time I'd tried to share even a small victory, it had been questioned, minimized, or dismissed. Because in their narrative, I was always the wayward daughter, the one who had rejected the safe path. Because somewhere along the way, I'd stopped expecting them to be proud of me. I don't know, I lied, unwilling to wound them with the truth. I guess I got used to handling things on my own. Well, my mother said after a long pause, this is surprising news. Tony was unusually silent, studying his plate with intense concentration. Melissa looked uncomfortable, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. The children, blessedly, remained oblivious to the tension, negotiating a complex trade of turkey for extra dessert. Surprising, my father repeated. That's one word for it. I could see him recalibrating, adjusting his perception of me in real time. His expression cycled through disbelief, skepticism, and finally, a reluctant acceptance. But acceptance wasn't the same as pride or joy in my accomplishments. It was merely an acknowledgement of facts he could no longer deny. So, he continued, reaching for his wine glass, you're telling us you're some kind of millionaire tech CEO all this time. The way he said it made it sound like I'd been hiding a criminal past. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I hadn't come here to win their approval. I'd come to honor my grandmother, to maintain the fragile connection to my family. Not to prove myself. But now that the truth was out, I couldn't help wondering, would this change anything? Would they finally see me, really see me, for who I was? Or would they find a new way to frame my success as something concerning, something lacking, something less than Tony's conventional achievements? Yes, I said simply. That's exactly what I'm telling you. The silence that followed my admission stretched uncomfortably. The only sounds were the gentle clink of silverware as Emma continued eating, oblivious to the adult's tension. I waited, my heart pounding, for someone to speak. Part of me wanted to pull up our company website on my phone, to show them the press coverage, the client testimonials, the awards. Another part of me resented that I felt the need to prove myself at all. Finally, my mother broke the silence with a nervous laugh. Well, this is certainly unexpected. Is it? I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Is it really so hard to believe I could be successful? My father cleared his throat. It's not about belief, Charlotte. It's about transparency. Families don't keep secrets like this from each other. Secrets? I repeated incredulously. It's not a secret. It's my life. My work. I've tried to tell you about it for years, but you've never shown interest. Every time I mentioned a new client or a company milestone, you changed the subject to Tony's promotion or the neighbor's new car or the church fundraiser. That's not fair, my mother protested, but her eyes flickered away from mine. We always ask how your work is going. You ask if I still have a job, I corrected. That's different from asking about my accomplishments or challenges or goals. Tony, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. So what you're saying is, you're rich. His tone was flat, difficult to read. All this time, you've been rich, and you never said anything. I sighed. Of course that would be his takeaway. The money, not the achievement. Not the years of hard work or the risks I'd taken or the barriers I'd overcome. I've been successful, I said carefully. Yes, that includes financial success. But it's about more than money. It's about building something meaningful, solving real problems, creating opportunities for my team. But you are rich, he pressed. I looked at him directly. On paper, yes. Most of my wealth is tied to my ownership stake in the company. It's not like I have millions sitting in a checking account, my father snorted. Millions. Listen to you. There it was again, the dismissal, the disbelief. Even faced with the truth, he couldn't quite accept it. Yes, Dad. Millions. I pulled out my phone, opened my investment portfolio app, and slid it across the table to him. See for yourself. He picked up the phone skeptically, then froze as he saw the numbers. His eyes widened, then narrowed, as if suspecting some kind of trick. This can't be right. It is, I said simply. My mother leaned over to look, and I heard her sharp intake of breath. Charlotte, this says— I know what it says, I interrupted gently, taking back my phone. That's my retirement account and personal investments, separate from my company equity. I've done well, I've been careful with my money, invested wisely. But you're always staying in that little apartment, my mother said, bewilderment clear in her voice. And you drive that ordinary car. When you visit, you never— She trailed off, but I knew what she meant. I never flaunted my wealth, never used it to impress them or buy their approval. I lived comfortably, but modestly, putting most of my earnings into investments, my foundation, and back into the company. I don't need a mansion or a luxury car to be happy, I explained. I have everything I need. Except a family, my mother couldn't help adding. I felt a familiar stab of irritation. I have family, just not the conventional kind you recognize. Friends aren't family, she repeated, as if the mantra could make it true. Mom, my executive team has been with me for 8 years. We've weathered crises together, celebrated victories, supported each other through personal challenges. Diane, my assistant, drove me to physical therapy 3 times a week for 6 months when my knee was at its worst. Maya stays with me on the anniversary of the IED attack every year because she knows I can't sleep. How is that not family? My mother looked genuinely confused, as if I were speaking a language she couldn't quite translate. The concept of chosen family, of bonds formed through shared purpose and mutual support rather than blood, was foreign to her worldview. It's different, she said finally. Different doesn't mean less valid, I countered. Tony, who had been processing the revelation of my wealth with visible discomfort, suddenly changed tactics. So, if you're so loaded, why didn't you help when Dad needed that surgery last year? Or when Mom's car broke down? We had to scramble to cover those expenses. The accusation caught me off guard. What surgery? What car problem? This is the first I'm hearing of either. My mother at least had the grace to look embarrassed. We didn't want to bother you. You're so busy with your company. So busy you couldn't come to Emma's birthday, Tony added. Or help when our furnace died in the middle of winter. I felt a surge of frustration. I wasn't invited to Emma's birthday, and no one told me about the furnace. You can't withhold information from me and then blame me for not helping with problems I didn't know existed. We shouldn't have to ask, my father said stubbornly. Family just knows when to step in. That's not fair, I protested. I live 3,000 miles away. I'm not psychic. If you need help, you have to actually tell me. Would you have helped? Tony challenged. Really? Or would you have been too busy with your millionaire tech CEO life? The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd missed before. Not just skepticism or dismissal, but envy, wounded pride. The golden son, the one who'd done everything right according to the family script, suddenly confronted with the reality that his wayward sister had achieved a level of success he couldn't match. Of course I would have helped, I said quietly. I always have, when I knew there was a need. And it was true. Despite the distance, despite the emotional gulf, I'd never turned my back on them. When my cousin needed specialized cancer treatment not covered by insurance, I'd anonymously paid the bills. When the church roof fund came up short, I'd made up the difference through a donation in my grandmother's name. I'd never flaunted my ability to help, but I'd never withheld it either. If you'd needed help with medical bills or repairs, all you had to do was ask, I continued. I would have been there in a heartbeat. My mother's eyes filled with tears, though whether from emotion or manipulation I couldn't tell. We didn't want charity, Charlotte. We wanted you. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. They wanted me. But which version? The dutiful daughter who followed their approved path? The Charlotte who needed their guidance and lived within their limitations? Or the actual me, with all my complexity and independence and accomplishments? I'm right here, I said. I've always been here, but you've never seen me, the real me. The real you, my father repeated skeptically. The secret millionaire? No, I said firmly. The woman who built something from nothing, who survived a war and brought that resilience into civilian life, who found purpose in protecting others from digital threats they can't even see. That's the real me, not just my bank account or my company valuation. It would have been nice to know who we were really talking to all this time, he muttered. The unfairness of this stung. You never asked, I said. You made assumptions, that I was struggling, that my career was unstable, that I couldn't possibly be successful on a path you didn't understand or approve of. You never once asked me to explain what I actually do or what I've achieved. Well, we're asking now, my mother said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. Tell us about this company of yours. Part of me wanted to refuse, to protect the truth of my accomplishments from their judgment, their inevitable minimization. But another part, the part that had always craved their understanding, seized the opening. CyberShield specializes in advanced threat detection and prevention, I began, choosing my words carefully. We develop proprietary software that identifies vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure, things like power grids, financial systems, government networks. The technology I developed can recognize patterns that indicate a breach or attack days before traditional security measures would catch it. My father frowned. And people pay for this? I nearly laughed. Yes, Dad. Quite a lot, actually. Our smallest contracts start at 6 figures. The major ones run into the millions annually. Millions, he repeated, still sounding disbelieving. For computer programs. For protection, I corrected. Most of our clients have already experienced devastating breaches that cost them far more than our services. We prevent that from happening. Again. And you created this program? Yourself? My mother seemed genuinely curious now, trying to reconcile the daughter she thought she knew with this unfamiliar version sitting at her table. I developed the core algorithm, I explained. It's based on pattern recognition techniques I learned in military intelligence. When I was deployed, I noticed that insurgent attacks followed subtle patterns, not obvious enough for traditional analysis to catch, but detectable if you knew what to look for. I realized the same principles could apply to cyber attacks. Military intelligence? Tony interrupted. I thought you were just, I don't know, driving trucks or something. The casual dismissal of my service might have angered me once. Now, it just reinforced how little they'd ever understood about my life. I was a military intelligence officer, I said evenly. I led a team that analyzed threat patterns to protect our troops. That's how I got injured. We were following up on intelligence I'd gathered about a potential ambush site. A flicker of something, respect, shock, crossed my father's face. You never told us that part. You never asked, I said again. The refrain of our relationship. You just saw the medical discharge and assumed failure. We were worried, my mother insisted. You came home injured, wouldn't talk about what happened, then moved across the country and started this computer thing. What were we supposed to think? You could have asked, I repeated. You could have shown interest in my recovery, my plans, my dreams. Instead, you pushed your own expectations. Move back home, get a stable job, settle down. We wanted what was best for you, my father said, the standard parental defense. No, I corrected gently. You wanted what you understood, what fit your worldview, security, predictability, proximity. But that was never who I was. My mother's eyes filled with tears again. We just wanted you to be happy, Charlotte. I am happy, I said, and meant it. I've built a life that fulfills me. I have work that matters, people I care about, the resources to help causes I believe in. It may not look like your definition of success, but it's mine. A silence fell over the table, less tense than before, but weighted with revelation. My father looked thoughtful, turning his wine glass slowly between his fingers. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Tony stared at his plate, shoulders slightly hunched. It was Melissa who finally broke the silence. I think what you've accomplished sounds amazing, Charlotte, she said, surprising me. We'd never been particularly close, her loyalty always lying firmly with Tony. Building a company like that from nothing, it's impressive. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by the unexpected support. So, what happens now? My father asked, an undercurrent of uncertainty in his voice. You go back to Seattle tomorrow. And we… what? Pretend we don't know our daughter is some tech tycoon? I smiled slightly at the term. Nothing has to change, Dad. I'm still the same person I was yesterday. The only difference is that now you know more about my life. Everything changes, he contradicted gruffly. You've been, what, playing a role when you visit? Hiding your success? Letting us think you were struggling when you were actually… I never said I was struggling, I pointed out. That was your assumption. And I wasn't playing a role, I just didn't. Correct your misconceptions because experience taught me you wouldn't believe me anyway. We would have believed you, my mother insisted. I raised an eyebrow. Really? When I told you about my first major client 3 years ago, Dad said it was probably just beginner's luck, and I shouldn't get used to that level of success. When I mentioned our expansion to international markets, Tony said it sounded risky and would probably end badly. When I tried to explain the patent I'd secured for my algorithm, Mom changed the subject to Mrs. Peterson's daughter's wedding. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognition flickering across their faces. We didn't understand, my mother offered weakly. You didn't try to understand, I corrected. There's a difference. The truth of it seemed to land finally. My father's expression shifted from defensive to contemplative. My mother looked genuinely regretful. Tony still seemed to be processing, his competitive nature warring with dawning respect. So, my father said after a long pause, tell us about this IPO thing. What exactly does that mean for your company? It was a small olive branch, but I recognized it for what it was. Perhaps the first genuine attempt he'd ever made to understand my work on its own terms, not filtered through his preconceptions of what counted as success. It means we'll become a publicly traded company, I explained. People will be able to buy shares on the stock market. The initial valuation will likely be around $200 million, possibly more depending on market conditions at the time. His eyebrows rose. And you own, what was it, 60%? 62, I corrected. Though I'll likely sell a small portion during the offering. The founders usually do. So you'll be worth... He paused, mental calculations visibly happening behind his eyes. On paper, more than $100 million, I confirmed. Though again, most of that will remain tied to the company, not liquid assets. The number hung in the air, too large to be easily dismissed or minimized. Tony let out a low whistle, earning a sharp look from Melissa. I don't even know what to say, my mother admitted. Our daughter, CEO, I supplied. Entrepreneur, founder, millionaire, Tony added, still sounding stunned. I looked around the table at their bewildered faces and felt a surprising wave of sympathy. In their world, this small town with its limited horizons and conventional definitions of success, my life was literally unimaginable. They lacked the context, the reference points to understand what I'd built. This is still me, I said gently. The same Charlotte who played soccer in high school and helped paint the church basement and joined the army against your advice. My bank account has changed, but I haven't. Not in any way that matters. My father took a long sip of his wine, studying me over the rim of his glass. When he set it down, his expression had changed. Not quite accepting, but less dismissive than before. I always knew you were smart, he said finally. Too smart for this town, maybe. That's why you left. It wasn't an apology, but from my father, it was as close as I was likely to get. An acknowledgement that my departure hadn't been rejection, but necessity. That my horizons had always been broader than what Meadowbrook, Pennsylvania could contain. I left because I needed to find my own path, I said carefully. Not because there was anything wrong with this one. The lie was small, almost kind. There had been plenty wrong with the life laid out for me here. The suffocating expectations, the narrow definitions of success, the constant pressure to conform. But there was no point in saying that now. Some truths serve no purpose except to wound. Well, my mother said, making a visible effort to rally. We're very proud of you, Charlotte. Of course we are. It's just a lot to take in. I smiled but didn't point out that their pride was newly minted, emerging only after learning about my financial success. That for years, they'd viewed my choices with disappointment at best, contempt at worst. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent a decade pitying the daughter who now had the resources to buy their entire town if she wanted to. I understand, I said. It's a big change from what you thought. It certainly is, Tony muttered, still processing the revelation. His earlier smugness had evaporated, replaced by something more complex. A mixture of disbelief, adjustment, and what looked suspiciously like calculation. So, he continued, leaning forward slightly, this IPO thing. Is there a way for family to get in on that? I've always been interested in investing. I nearly laughed at the transparency of it. 10 minutes ago, he'd been lecturing me on financial stability and the risks of tech startups. Now that he knew my company was valuable, he wanted a piece of it. The initial offering will be managed by our investment bankers, I explained. But there will be opportunities for early investment through specific channels. If you're interested, I can connect you with our financial team. I had no intention of doing so, of course. Tony had no experience with tech investments, no understanding of our market, and certainly no appreciation for what we'd built. His sudden interest was purely opportunistic, not the basis for sound investment decisions. I'd appreciate that, he said with a nod. Always good to diversify the portfolio. I bit back a smile at his attempt to sound financially sophisticated. Tony's portfolio consisted of a 401k from the bank and whatever equity he had in his modest house. Nothing wrong with that. It was prudent, conservative financial planning. But the pretense of being an experienced investor was transparent. Speaking of investment, my mother interjected, your grandmother would be so proud. She always believed in you, you know, even when you made unconventional choices. The mention of my grandmother brought a genuine pang of grief. She would have understood what I'd built, not because she knew anything about technology or business, but because she'd always seen me clearly, had recognized my restlessness, my need for challenge, my inability to fit into the prescribed patterns. I miss her, I said simply. We all do, my mother agreed. She was quite a woman, strong-minded, like you. It was perhaps the first genuine compliment she'd given me in years, comparing me to the family matriarch, acknowledging the steel in my spine as inheritance rather than defiance. Which reminds me, my father said, setting down his fork. The lawyer will be reading her will tomorrow at 10. Obviously you'll want to be there, given your flight situation. The awkward phrasing made it clear. They'd assumed I would change my plans now, delay my return to Seattle to attend the reading. The old Charlotte might have bristled at the presumption. The new one recognized it as an olive branch, a way of including me in family business I'd been excluded from for years. I can move some meetings around, I said. My team is used to flexibility. Your team, my father repeated, testing the words. Hard to picture you with employees. Last time you were here, you couldn't even get your cousin Jamie to help you move furniture. I smiled, remembering the surly teenager who'd complained incessantly about helping me rearrange my childhood bedroom during my last extended stay. Different context, different dynamics. My team is exceptional, skilled, dedicated professionals who believe in our mission. And what is that mission exactly? He asked, sounding genuinely curious for the first time. Beyond making money, I mean. The question surprised me. It was the first time he'd ever asked about the purpose of my work, not just its practicalities or profitability. We protect critical infrastructure from cyber attacks, I explained. Power grids, water treatment facilities, healthcare systems, financial networks, the digital backbones that keep society functioning. When these systems are compromised, it's not just an inconvenience. People can die. Economies can collapse. I thought of attacks we'd prevented, attempts to access, hospital networks that could have altered medication dosages, infiltrations of power grid controls that might have left cities vulnerable during extreme weather, breaches of financial systems that would have stolen life savings from thousands. Every day, there are thousands of attempts to access these systems by various threat actors, criminal organizations, hostile governments, even individual hackers with grudges. Our technology identifies these attempts earlier and more accurately than conventional security measures. I paused, realizing I'd slipped into what Maya called my TED Talk mode, the passionate, articulate explanation I gave to potential investors or new hires. Sorry, I said. I get carried away sometimes. No, it's interesting, my father said, and seemed to mean it. I just never understood what you actually did. Cybersecurity sounds like science fiction to people my age. It's very real, I assured him, and increasingly critical. Most people don't realize how vulnerable our digital infrastructure is, or how catastrophic a successful attack could be. And the government pays you to prevent this? My mother asked, still trying to wrap her head around my business model. Government agencies are some of our clients, yes, but also private corporations, healthcare networks, financial institutions, any organization with critical digital assets to protect. Emma, who had been quietly eating her dessert, suddenly looked up. Do you stop bad guys from stealing stuff on computers? She asked, her 7-year-old mind distilling my explanation to its essence. I smiled at her. That's exactly right, sweetheart. My company helps stop bad guys from stealing important things or breaking important systems on computers. She nodded solemnly. That's cool. Way cooler than Daddy's job at the boring bank. Emma, Melissa scolded, while Tony looked mildly offended. I laughed, genuinely delighted by her assessment. Banks are important too, I said diplomatically. Your dad helps people buy houses and start businesses. But you fight bad guys, she insisted, with the clarity of childhood. Like a superhero, but with computers. Something like that, I agreed, touched by her simple validation. From the mouths of babes, as they say. The moment lightened the atmosphere, dispelling some of the tension that had built over dinner. As my mother cleared the dessert plates and prepared coffee, the conversation drifted to safer topics. Local. Gossip, plans for the new year, the children's school activities. I found myself observing my family as if from a distance, noting the subtle shifts in their behavior toward me. My father addressing me directly more often, actually listening to my responses. My mother's nervous pride, awkwardly shoehorning references to Charlotte's important work into unrelated topics. Tony's alternating envy and calculation, reassessing our sibling dynamic in light of my revealed success. It was strange. Nothing had actually changed about me, but their perception had undergone a seismic shift. I was the same person who had arrived 3 days ago, carrying the same accomplishments. The same history, the same values. The only difference was that now they knew about one aspect of my life, its financial dimension. And suddenly, I was worth listening to, worth including, worth respecting. The realization was both satisfying and deeply sad. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where my father built a fire in the old fireplace that still didn't draw properly, filling the room with a faint, smoky haze that had been part of Christmas for as long as I could remember. The children sprawled on the floor with their new toys while the adults settled into their usual positions. My father in his recliner, my mother on the end of the sofa closest to him, Tony and Melissa sharing the love seat. I took the armchair, by the window, the designated spot for guests. A subtle reminder that despite being in my childhood home, I was now an outsider, a visitor. So, Charlotte, my mother began, her tone falsely casual, will you be staying in Seattle after your company goes public? Or might you consider moving somewhere closer? The loaded question hung in the air. Translation: now that you're successful, will you finally conform to our expectations and come home? Seattle is home for me now, I said gently but firmly. My company is there, my friends, my life, but I could certainly visit more often. It was a peace offering of sorts. I wouldn't uproot my life to satisfy their desire for proximity, but I could make more effort to maintain connections. Perhaps now that they saw me more clearly, those connections might be less strained, less performative. That would be nice, my mother said, though disappointment flickered across her face. We miss you. Did they miss me, I wondered, or the idea of me? The compliant daughter they thought I should be, rather than the independent woman I'd become? Miss you too, I said, and was surprised to find it partly true. I missed what we could have been to each other in a world where they'd accepted my choices, celebrated my successes on my terms, loved me for who I was rather than who they wanted me to be. My father cleared his throat. Your grandmother's house, he said abruptly. No one's discussed what happens to it yet. The will reading tomorrow will settle it, of course, but I assume it will be sold. Unless... He let the suggestion hang, unspoken but clear. Unless you want it. Unless you're coming. Back. I'm not planning to move back to Meadowbrook, I said, more gently than I might have a few hours ago. But I appreciate the thought. It's a good investment property, Tony chimed in. Real estate in this area is undervalued. You could rent it out, build equity. The suggestion was so practical, so conventional, so typically Tony. As if my grandmother's beloved home, with its meticulously tended garden, its cluttered sewing room where she'd taught me to make quilts, its kitchen, where she'd slipped me extra cookies and whispered encouragement, could be reduced to square footage and rental potential. I'll consider it, I said noncommittally. Depends on what the will specifies. The mention of the will seemed to trigger something in my mother. She exchanged a glance with my father, a silent communication I couldn't interpret. About that, she said, suddenly interested in smoothing a non-existent wrinkle in her skirt. There's something you should know before tomorrow. I tensed, recognizing the tone. It was the same one she'd used before delivering other uncomfortable truths throughout my childhood. Charlotte, your goldfish died while you were at camp. Charlotte, we can't afford the soccer camp scholarship didn't come through. Charlotte, your father and I think the military is a terrible idea. What is it? I asked cautiously. Your grandmother made some specific provisions, she said, still not meeting my eyes. She was very fond of you, you know. Always said you reminded her of herself at your age. Mom? I prompted when she didn't continue. What provisions? My father took over, his tone more direct. The thing is, Charlotte, your grandmother had resources we weren't aware of. Investments from when your grandfather was alive. She never touched the principal, lived on the interest. Very frugal, your grandmother. I nodded, unsurprised. She'd grown up during the Depression, had known genuine poverty. Her careful management of resources wasn't miserliness, but a bone-deep caution born of experience. And? I prompted. And it seems she's left a substantial portion of those investments to you, he continued. The lawyer wouldn't give us specifics, but he indicated it's significant. I blinked, genuinely surprised. I'd expected perhaps a keepsake or two. Her wedding ring, maybe, or the quilt we'd made together during my high school years. Not money. I certainly didn't need it, and the timing of this revelation, right after they'd learned of my financial success, struck me as oddly coincidental. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Why not let the lawyer explain tomorrow? My mother finally looked up. We thought you should be prepared. It's quite a responsibility, an inheritance. And we wanted you to know that your father and we're very proud of how you've managed your finances. Your grandmother clearly thought so too. The praise rang hollow, coming hours after they'd learned of my wealth. I studied their faces, trying to discern their true motivation for this preview of tomorrow's revelation. There's something else, I guessed, reading their expressions. Something you're not telling me. Tony shifted uncomfortably on the love seat. Melissa suddenly became very interested in straightening Jacob's rumpled shirt. My parents exchanged another meaningful glance. The thing is, my father said slowly, your grandmother left specific instructions about her house. It seems she wanted it preserved, not sold. She established a trust for its maintenance. She was very clear that it should remain in the family as a gathering place, I suppose you'd call it. I waited, sensing there was more to this story. And she named you as the trustee, he finally admitted. Not me, not your mother. You. Ah, there it was. The source of their discomfort. My grandmother had entrusted me, the distant granddaughter, the family outsider, with the preservation of the family homestead, had placed me in a position of authority over a property that held deep meaning for all of them. I see, I said carefully. That's unexpected. Very, my mother agreed, a hint of resentment in her tone. Considering you've been in Seattle all these years while we've been checking on her, helping with maintenance, bringing her groceries. The implication was clear. I hadn't earned this responsibility. I hadn't put in the time, the effort, the proximity-based care that they had. In their view, the honor should have gone to them, the dutiful, present family members. I'm sure she had her reasons, I said neutrally, unwilling to be drawn into a defense of a decision I hadn't made and hadn't even known about until moments ago. She always did like you best, Tony muttered, the childhood complaint slipping out. Before he could stop it, I raised an eyebrow. This isn't about favorites, Tony. It's about who she trusted to honor her wishes. which apparently wasn't her own daughter, my mother said, unable to keep the hurt from her voice, or the grandson who lives 15 minutes away. I sighed, already feeling the weight of the family dynamics that would now be attached to this inheritance. Mom, I'm sure it wasn't a rejection of you or Tony. Grandma probably had specific reasons for her choice. Well, we'll find out tomorrow, I suppose, my father said, effectively closing the subject. The lawyer will explain everything. The conversation moved on to safer topics, but the undercurrent remained. The unspoken resentment, the subtle challenge to my worthiness as the chosen trustee. I found myself torn between gratitude for my grandmother's trust and apprehension about the complications it would create in my already strained family relationships. Later, as the evening wound down and I prepared to return to my childhood bedroom for what would now be an additional night, Tony caught me alone in the hallway. So, he said, his voice low to avoid being overheard. Quite a day of revelations, huh? Tech millionaire sister? Surprise inheritance? I studied him, trying to gauge his mood. The competitive edge was still there, but tempered now with something else. Curiosity, perhaps? Or a grudging respect? Life is full of surprises, I agreed neutrally. Listen, he continued, glancing over his shoulder to ensure we weren't overheard. About what I said at dinner. The investment opportunity. I was serious. If there's a way for family to get in early on this IPO, I'd appreciate the consideration. I nodded, non-committal. As I said, I can put you in touch with our financial team. They handle all the pre-IPO investments. Right, he said, then hesitated. Look, Charlotte, I know we haven't always understood each other, but we're still family, and family looks out for each other, right? There it was, the transactional view of family that had always permeated our relationships. Support contingent on compliance, love dependent on conformity, and now, access to financial opportunity based on blood ties rather than merit or understanding. I'll see what I can do, I said, deliberately vague. But these decisions aren't entirely up to me. There are regulatory considerations, investor qualifications. But you're the boss, right? He pressed. The CEO, surely you have some pull. I smiled, tightly. It's more complicated than that, but I'll explore the options. He seemed satisfied with this, patting my shoulder with newfound camaraderie. That's my successful sister, always making things happen. As he walked away, I wondered at the speed of his adjustment, how quickly he'd pivoted from dismissing my career to attempting to profit from it. How rapidly he'd rewritten our sibling narrative from sensible brother, struggling sister, to successful siblings with complementary strengths. It was, in its way, almost impressive. A masterclass in adaptability, in recognizing which way the wind was blowing and adjusting one's sails accordingly. I made my way to my childhood bedroom, closing the door on the day's revelations and confrontations. Tomorrow would bring the official reading of my grandmother's will, more family dynamics to navigate, more expectations to manage. But tonight, as I changed into pajamas and slipped between the sheets of my too-small twin bed, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They'd seen me today. Really seen me. Perhaps for the first time. Not completely, not perfectly, and certainly not without complications. But it was a start. A crack in the facade of misunderstanding that had separated us for years. Whether that crack would widen into genuine understanding or simply create new fissures remained to be seen. But for now, in the quiet of my childhood room, surrounded by the ghosts of who I'd been and the truth of who I'd become, it felt like enough. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through the faded curtains of my childhood bedroom. For a moment, disoriented between sleep and wakefulness, I forgot where I was, expecting the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Seattle condo, the distant view of Mount Rainier on clear days, the sleek minimalism of the space I'd created for myself. Instead, I opened my eyes to posters I'd outgrown decades ago, participation trophies gathering dust on shelves, the narrow twin bed that had never quite accommodated my adult frame. The physical reminders of a life I'd left behind, preserved like artifacts in a museum dedicated to a version of me that no longer existed. My phone buzzed with notifications, emails from my executive team, updates on year-end reports, a text from Maya asking how the family fun was going. The digital intrusion of my real life into this time capsule felt jarring but necessary, grounding me in who I actually was rather than who this room suggested I should be. I showered and dressed with care, selecting a simple black dress that whispered rather than shouted its expense, paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me when I graduated high school. Professional but understated, appropriate for a will reading without flaunting the wealth my family had only just discovered. Downstairs, the atmosphere was subdued. My mother moved around the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, making coffee and toast without her usual running commentary. My father sat at the table reading the local newspaper, the crease between his brows deeper than usual. "Morning," I said, pouring myself coffee. My father grunted in acknowledgement. My mother turned, surprise flickering across her face at my appearance. "You look nice," she said, the compliment sounding almost like an accusation. "Thanks," I replied. "What time are we leaving for the lawyer's office?" 9:30, my father answered, not looking up from his paper. "Tony and Melissa are meeting us there. The drive to downtown Meadowbrook, a generous term for the 4-block stretch of small businesses that constituted the commercial center of my hometown, passed in awkward silence. The family law firm of Peterson & Sons occupied the second floor of a brick building above the hardware store, its entrance marked by a discreet brass plaque that had been there since before I was born. Inside, the office remained frozen in time. Wood-paneled walls, green leather chairs worn smooth by decades of anxious clients, framed diplomas yellowing behind glass. Even the receptionist seemed unchanged, though she must have been at least 80 by now. "The Reed family," my father announced unnecessarily, "for Margaret Reed's will reading." "Yes, of course," she nodded. "Mr. Peterson is expecting you. The others are already here." We were ushered into a conference room where Tony and Melissa sat on one side of a long table, with an elderly gentleman I recognized as Henry Peterson Jr. at the head. A younger man who bore a striking resemblance to him, presumably Henry Peterson III, stood beside a projection screen. "Ah, good, we're all here," Mr. Peterson said, rising slightly as we entered. "Please, take a seat." My parents sat beside Tony and Melissa, a united front of local Reeds. I took a chair on the opposite side, the physical arrangement unconsciously mirroring the emotional reality. Them versus me, the hometown team against the outsider. "Before we begin," Mr. Peterson said, adjusting his reading glasses, "I want to express my personal condolences. Margaret was not just a client but a dear friend. Her loss is deeply felt by many in this community." Murmurs of agreement circled the table. My grandmother had been a pillar of Meadowbrook, church treasurer, hospital volunteer, organizer of the annual quilt auction that funded the town's small library. Her absence would leave a void in more than just our family. "Now, to business," Mr. Peterson continued. "Margaret's will is straightforward in many respects. She was always a woman who knew her mind and expressed it clearly." He nodded to his son, who dimmed the lights and activated the projector. An image of a typed document appeared on the screen, my grandmother's last will and testament, dated just 6 months earlier. "I'll summarize the main provisions before we address specific bequests," Mr. Peterson explained. "Margaret's estate consists of her home and property, valued at approximately $215,000, her personal possessions, and a portfolio of investments, currently valued at just over $1.2 million. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. Tony shifted in his seat. Even my father looked surprised. They'd known my grandmother had resources, but clearly the extent had been unexpected. The investment portfolio was established by Margaret's late husband, your father, Robert, Mr. Peterson said, nodding to my mother. Through Margaret's careful management and some fortunate investment choices, it grew substantially over the years. She lived modestly on the interest, never touching the principal. My mother's expression flickered between shock and something harder to read. Perhaps a reassessment of her own mother, whom she'd always characterized as frugal to the point of excessive thrift. That frugality, it seemed, had been strategic, rather than necessary. The will specifies several smaller bequests, Mr. Peterson continued, $10,000 each to St. Mark's Church Building Fund, the Meadowbrook Hospital Auxiliary, and the Public Library Foundation. $20,000 to her bridge club to fund their annual trip for the next decade. Personal items distributed according to this list. He handed copies of a typed inventory to each of us. I scanned it quickly, noting with a pang that she'd left. Me her quilting supplies and pattern books, remembering the hours we'd spent together at her old Singer machine. Her patient guidance as I learned to piece together fabric into something beautiful and lasting. Now, as to the main estate, Mr. Peterson continued. Margaret left specific instructions regarding both her home and her investment portfolio. He looked directly at me, and I felt the weight of every gaze in the room shift to follow his. The house and surrounding property are to be placed in a trust, with Charlotte Reed designated as trustee. The property is not to be sold but maintained as a family gathering place for at least 20 years from the date of Margaret's passing. The expected bombshell, now officially delivered. I kept my expression neutral, aware of the tension emanating from my family members across the table. Additionally, Mr. Peterson continued, a fund of $200,000 from the investment portfolio is to be set aside for the maintenance and upkeep of the property during this period. As for the remainder of the investment portfolio, Mr. Peterson continued, approximately $1 million, Margaret has directed that it be divided as follows: 25% to her daughter, Elizabeth Reed. My mother nodded stiffly, her expression unreadable. 25% to her grandson, Anthony Reed. Tony's eyebrows rose slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. And 50%, Mr. Peterson paused, his eyes moving to me, to her granddaughter, Charlotte Reed. The silence that followed was dense enough to cut with a knife. I kept my face carefully neutral, though inside I was reeling. $500,000, a fortune by Meadowbrook standards, though less significant given my current financial situation, but the symbolism of the unequal distribution wouldn't be lost on anyone in the room. Additionally, Mr. Peterson continued when no one spoke, Margaret left letters for each of you to be read privately. He removed 3 envelopes from a folder and slid them across the table. Cream-colored stationery with our names written in my grandmother's elegant, old-fashioned script. My fingers closed around mine, recognizing the familiar handwriting that had addressed birthday cards and Christmas packages throughout my life, even during the years when distance and family tension had strained other connections. There is one final provision, Mr. Peterson said, clearing his throat. Margaret requested that a specific statement be read aloud at this meeting, in the presence of all beneficiaries. He lifted a single sheet of paper, adjusting his glasses before reading. To my beloved family, the decisions reflected in this will were made with careful consideration, not on impulse or emotion. The distribution of my estate is not a reflection of love, which has always been given equally, but of need, opportunity, and values. I ask that you respect my choices without resentment or division. Remember that what binds you is stronger than any material consideration. With eternal love, Margaret Reed. The formal language couldn't disguise my grandmother's voice. Practical, direct, but with an underlying compassion that had been her hallmark. I found myself blinking back unexpected tears, hearing her in my mind as clearly as if she were sitting at the table with us. Mr. Peterson set the paper down. That concludes the formal reading. There are, of course, documents for each of you to sign. The trust paperwork will require more extensive review, particularly for Charlotte as trustee. Perhaps we could schedule a separate meeting to address those details? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Across the table, my mother's lips were pressed into a thin line. My father stared at his hands, face unreadable. Tony's expression had hardened, the initial satisfaction at his inheritance now tempered by the reality that his sister had received twice as much. If there are no immediate questions, Mr. Peterson continued, my son will help you with the necessary signatures while I prepare copies of the relevant documents for each of you. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of paperwork and subdued, legal explanations. I signed where indicated, accepted folders of documents, and responded to questions with automatic politeness, my mind still processing the implications of my grandmother's decisions. Not just the money, which I didn't need, but the responsibility she'd placed in my hands. The trust, the family home, the clear statement of confidence in me, despite my physical absence from her day-to-day life, and the equally clear message to my parents and brother, who might have expected their proximity and regular assistance to be rewarded differently. When we finally emerged from the law office into the brittle winter sunlight, the silence continued. We walked to the parking lot in a tight group that nonetheless felt fractured, each of us isolated in our own thoughts. Well, my father said as we reached the cars, his first word since the reading began. That was unexpected. My mother made a small sound that might have been agreement or protest. Tony stood slightly apart, keys in hand, expression closed. I think, I said carefully, we should take some time to process before discussing this further. Process what? Tony asked, a sharp edge to his voice. That grandma played favorites? That the golden granddaughter who couldn't be bothered to visit gets the lion's share? Tony, Melissa murmured, placing a hand on his arm. No, he said, shaking her off. It's not right. Mom and Dad were there for her every day. I checked on her 3 times a week. Charlotte shows up for Christmas once every few years and gets half the money plus control of the house? How is that fair? The accusation stung, not because it was entirely accurate. I'd maintained a close relationship with my grandmother, despite the distance, but because it contained enough truth to wound. I hadn't been physically present. I hadn't shoveled her driveway or driven her to doctor's appointments or brought her groceries during snowstorms. Your grandmother made her decisions for her own reasons, my father said, surprising me with his neutral tone. It's not our place to question them. Dad, come on, Tony protested. You can't tell me you think this is reasonable. What I think, my father replied, is that Margaret Reed was of sound mind and had every right to distribute her estate as she saw fit, and that standing in a parking lot arguing about it dishonors her memory. His unexpected reasonableness caught us all off guard. My mother looked at him with something like shock, while Tony's mouth opened and closed without sound, arguments dying before they could be voiced. Your father's right, my mother finally said, though the tension in her voice suggested the agreement cost her. This isn't the place. We should go home. I think I need some time, I said, the weight of the morning heavy on my shoulders. I might take a walk downtown, clear my head. My mother frowned. But we should discuss the arrangements, the trust. Later, I interrupted gently. We have time for that. Right now, I just need some space. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked away, letter from my grandmother burning a hole in my coat pocket, heart pounding with emotions I couldn't yet name. Behind me, I heard the murmur of conversation, car doors opening and closing, engines starting. I walked without direction, moving away from the cluster of law and insurance offices toward the small park that marked the center of Meadowbrook. The day was cold but sunny, the park deserted save for an elderly man walking a small dog along the perimeter path. Finding an empty bench, I sat and finally withdrew the envelope from my pocket. For a long moment, I just held it, tracing my name in my grandmother's distinctive handwriting, reluctant to break the seal and confront whatever message lay within. Her final words to me, impossible to unhear once read. Finally, taking a deep breath, I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, I've taken my final journey, hopefully to somewhere with better gardening weather and no troublesome arthritis. Don't be sad for me. At 87, I've had a full life, rich with love and lessons, even if not always easy. I've made decisions about my estate that may cause confusion or hurt feelings. I want you to understand my reasoning, which has nothing to do with favoritism and everything to do with clear-eyed assessment of needs and capabilities. The truth is, Charlotte, you remind me of myself, not the cautious widow your mother knew, but the young woman I was before convention and circumstance narrowed my path. I had dreams once, ambitions that reached beyond Meadowbrook. But I met your grandfather, fell in love, and chose a different life. I don't regret that choice, but I've always wondered about the roads not taken. You chose differently. You faced the same pressures to conform, to shrink yourself to fit others' expectations, and you refused. You built a life on your own terms, followed your convictions even when it meant standing alone. I've watched from a distance, prouder than you can imagine. Your family doesn't see you clearly. They never have. They measure success in familiar units. The house with the picket fence, the spouse, the children, the job their neighbors understand. They can't comprehend the magnitude of what you've built because it exists outside their frame of reference. But I see you, Charlotte. I always have. I've left you the larger portion of my estate not because you need it. We both know you don't. But because I trust you to use it wisely, to continue building something meaningful. And I've made you trustee of the house because despite the physical distance, you understand better than the others what that home represented to me. Not just walls and a roof, but independence, sanctuary, a space entirely my own. The money is yours to use as you see fit. The house, I hope, will become a true family gathering place, neutral territory where the bonds between you all might strengthen over time. You have the vision to make that happen, the strength to weather the initial resentment, and the wisdom to build bridges when others would construct walls. Don't let temporary discord discourage you. Your parents and brother love you, but love isn't always clear-sighted. They'll need time to adjust their perception of you, to reconcile the child they thought they knew with the extraordinary woman you've become. Remember that true family transcends blood ties. It's found in those who see you clearly, who celebrate your strengths without needing to diminish them, who love you not despite your differences, but because of them. You've built such connections in your chosen home. Cherish them. But don't give up on the family you were born into, imperfect as they may be. There's healing possible there, if approached with patience and compassion. You've always had the courage to forge your own path. Now, I'm asking you to have the courage to reach back, to create connection without compromising who you are. It won't be easy. Few worthwhile things are. Know that wherever I am, I'm watching with unwavering faith in you. You were always my brightest star, Charlotte. Keep shining with eternal love, Grandma P.S. The emerald earrings are in the false bottom of my jewelry box. They deserve someone who'll actually wear them, not just lock them away for special occasions that never come. Life itself is the special occasion. Never forget that. I read the letter twice, tears blurring my vision, a complex tangle of grief and gratitude tightening my chest. My grandmother's voice, practical, wise, seeing beyond surfaces, filled each word. She had known me, truly known me, in a way no one else in my family ever had. The park bench was cold beneath me, the winter sun offering light without warmth. I folded the letter carefully, returning it to its envelope, then sat motionless, letting my grandmother's final message settle into my heart. She was right, of course. About everything. About my family's limited perspective. About the possibility of healing. About the need for courage in building bridges rather than walls. About the true nature of family found in recognition and acceptance rather than mere biological connection. My phone buzzed, a text from my mother. "Where are you? We're waiting at the house." Such a simple message, freighted with unspoken complications. We needed to talk, all of us, about the estate, about the trust, about the future, but more importantly, we needed to see each other clearly, perhaps for the first time. I stood, tucking the letter securely in my inner pocket, and began walking toward my grandmother's house. Now, in some legal sense, my house, though I knew it would always belong more to her memory than to any paperwork. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations, old wounds reopened, new boundaries established. My family might never fully understand the life I'd built, or the choices I'd made. But perhaps, with time and patience, they could learn to respect them. To see me as I actually was, not as they wished me to be. And I would need to do the same, to see them with clearer eyes, to recognize the love that existed beneath the judgment and misunderstanding, to find ways to connect without requiring their validation or diminishing my truth. As I approached the familiar driveway, I saw them waiting. My parents on the porch, Tony pacing the front lawn, all of them uncertain, uncomfortable, but present. Family, in all its messy, imperfect reality. I thought of my grandmother's words, "Life itself is the special occasion." With that wisdom guiding me, I straightened my shoulders and walked forward to meet whatever came next. 3 months later, I stood in my grandmother's, now my, kitchen, surveying the transformation. The dated floral wallpaper had been replaced with warm cream paint, the ancient appliances upgraded to energy-efficient models, the scarred linoleum exchanged for sustainable bamboo flooring. But the heart of the space remained, the bay window, overlooking the garden where spring bulbs were just beginning to emerge, the round oak table where 3 generations of Reeds had shared meals and conversations, the corner where my grandmother's prized African violet still thrived under my mother's. "Careful attention. The contractors did good work," my father commented, running a hand along the new countertop. "Solid craftsmanship." "The local company you recommended?" I replied, acknowledging his contribution to the renovation. They understood the importance of preserving the character while updating the functionality. It was the kind of practical discussion we'd become comfortable with over the past months. We were finding our way toward a new relationship, not instantly close, not without occasional tension, but evolving. He'd stopped dismissing my career, had actually asked thoughtful questions about cybersecurity during his and my mother's visit to Seattle last month. I'd stopped expecting him to fully understand my world, appreciating instead the efforts he made to connect. "Tony and Melissa are bringing the kids around too," my mother said, entering from the dining room where she'd been arranging flowers. "The housewarming party starts at 3. The party had been her idea, a way to reintroduce the renovated house to family and close friends, to establish its new identity as a gathering place. I'd agreed readily, recognizing the gesture for what it was, her attempt to honor both my grandmother's wishes and my role as trustee. Our relationship remained the most complex, fraught with unspoken expectations and deeper wounds. But we were trying, both of us, to build something new from the complicated foundation of our past. "Charlotte," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what your grandmother wrote, in my letter, I mean, about seeing people as they are, not as we wish them to be." I nodded, surprised by the reference. We rarely discussed the private letters, though I knew each of us had received one. "I haven't always seen you clearly," she continued. "I wanted a certain life for you, marriage, children, proximity. I thought that was what happiness looked like because it's what I knew. Mom, I began, but she shook her head. Let me finish. I'm trying to see you now. Really see you. The woman who built an extraordinary career, who protects people from dangers most of us don't even understand, who has created meaningful connections and purpose on her own terms. I'm proud of that woman. I just need to get better at showing. Tears pricked my eyes, unexpected emotion rising at this stumbling but sincere attempt at recognition. Thank you, I said simply. That means more than you know. She nodded, her own eyes suspiciously bright, then busied herself rearranging flowers that needed no adjustment. Some things would take time. The doorbell rang, Tony and his family arriving early. As I went to answer it, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent in this house for years. Not perfect harmony, not complete understanding, but possibility. An opening where before there had been only walls. Emma burst through the door first, wrapping her arms around my waist. Aunt Charlotte, did you bring me something from Seattle? I laughed, lifting her into a hug. Maybe. We'll see after lunch. Tony followed, carrying Jacob on his shoulders, Melissa behind them with a casserole dish. The awkwardness between us had faded somewhat, replaced by a cautious respect. The competitive edge remained, perhaps it always would, but it had softened, tempered by our grandmother's final lesson about the true value of family. Place looks good, he said, setting Jacob down. The contractors finished on schedule? 2 days early, I confirmed. And under budget, he grinned. Of course they did. Nobody messes with the big shot CEO. The teasing held no malice now, just a brother's recognition of his sister's competence. Progress, small but significant. As we moved toward the kitchen, I paused in the entryway where I'd hung a new photograph, my grandmother in her garden, laughing at something off-camera, vibrant and entirely herself. Beside it, I'd placed a small plaque with words from her letter. Life itself is the special occasion. I touched the frame lightly, a silent thank you for her final gift. Not the money, which I'd largely donated to veterans' education programs, but the perspective. The permission to be fully myself while still reaching for connection. The reminder that true family sees you clearly and loves you completely, whether bound by blood or by choice. The house filled with voices and laughter, the gathering extending beyond my immediate family to include neighbors, church friends, even a few of my Seattle colleagues who'd flown in for the occasion. My worlds merging, not seamlessly but with growing ease. Later, as the party wound down and twilight softened the edges of my grandmother's garden, I found myself alone on the back porch, watching the first stars appear above the old maple tree. Quite a day, my father said, joining me with 2 glasses of whiskey. He handed me one, then settled into the adjacent chair with a sigh that spoke of contentment rather than weariness. She would have approved, I said, raising my glass toward the darkening sky. The house full of people, everyone welcome. He nodded, following my gaze upward. Your grandmother was the wisest person I ever knew. Took me decades to realize it, stubborn as I was. Stubbornness runs in the family, I observed with a smile. That it does. He sipped his whiskey, contemplative. You know, when you first told us about your company, your success, I wasn't just surprised, I was ashamed. I turned to him, questioning. Ashamed that I'd underestimated you so completely, that I'd never bothered to understand what you were building. Too caught up in my own narrow definition of achievement to recognize yours. The admission, so uncharacteristic of my taciturn father, caught me off guard. Dad, you didn't. I did. He interrupted gently. We all did. But your grandmother saw you clearly from the beginning, knew exactly what you were capable of. He shook his head, a rueful smile softening his features. She always was a better judge of character than the rest of us. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the evening settling around us like a comfortable blanket. I'm glad you're keeping the house, he said finally. Not just because it stays in the family, but because you'll do right by it. Honor what it meant to her. That's the plan, I agreed. A place where everyone belongs, no matter how far they've traveled. He nodded, understanding the layers in my words. Then, with characteristic pragmatism, the guest room renovations are coming along. Well, by summer you'll have proper space for visitors. Including you and Mom, I asked, knowing how difficult travel had become for them in recent years. We've been talking about that, he said, surprising me again. A longer visit, maybe. Couple of weeks in the summer. Your mother's never seen the Pacific Ocean. The simple statement held volumes, an openness to new experiences, a willingness to step into my world rather than expecting me to conform to theirs. Another small bridge across the divide. I'd like that, I said softly. Very much. Above us, stars multiplied, across the darkening sky, each distinct yet part of a greater constellation. I thought of my grandmother's words about true family transcending blood ties, found in those who see you clearly, who celebrate your strengths without needing to diminish them. I had such connections in Seattle, Maya, Diane, my team, the veterans I mentored. And now, perhaps, the beginnings of a new kind of connection with my parents and brother. Not dependent on proximity or conformity, but built on growing mutual respect and the shared recognition that love, at its best, allows us to remain authentically ourselves. As we sat in comfortable silence, I felt a deep gratitude for all of it. The difficult Christmas dinner that had forced truth into the open. My grandmother's final wisdom guiding us forward. The painful but necessary conversations that had followed. And now this moment of quiet understanding beneath the stars she had taught me to name. Family. Complicated, imperfect, evolving. Worth the work of building bridges, even when it would be easier to construct walls. Worth coming home to, in all the many ways that home can be defined. Thank you for tuning in to today's story. If you enjoyed Mom and Dad Called Me a Failure at Christmas Dinner, then my net worth was revealed. Please hit that subscribe button now to make sure you never miss another inspiring story on our channel. Each week, we bring you powerful narratives about overcoming adversity, standing in your truth, and finding strength in difficult circumstances. Don't forget to tap the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we upload new content. Your support means everything to us, and we love hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. What did you think of Charlotte's journey? Have you ever been in a situation where your family didn't recognize your true worth? Subscribe now for more life-changing stories that will inspire, motivate, and remind you that sometimes the people who underestimate you are the ones who help you discover just how strong you really are. See you in our next video.